Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Northern Virginia. Joining me, as always, is FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor Adam Tooze, this week in Hong Kong. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, one data point for you all, by which I mean one topic. The data point is 80%. That is the share of the UN's official Sustainable Development Goals that are currently off track in terms of being achieved by 2030, which is the official goal. In fact, that is not an enormous surprise. In July 2023, the UN even admitted that progress on more than half of the SDGs was weak and insufficient. Even another 30% had gone into reverse, according to the UN itself. And these Sustainable Development Goals were basically put in place 10 years ago with the, pretty lofty goal of developing the world, guaranteeing peace and prosperity for people and the planet. And, in a more general sense, they were meant to replace the Millennium Development Goals that had been in effect and put into effect by the UN for the couple decades prior. All this falls under the heading of global development, which has been a goal for the entire world for many decades. But as is obvious in its current iteration, sustainable development is experiencing some problems. And that was evident in the conference that the UN held in Sevilla a few weeks ago, in which they tried to make some further progress towards these goals, but by most accounts didn't really affect the trajectory that these goals have been on. So we thought we'd take a closer look at what exactly is going wrong and maybe what could change going forward. So Adam, to start off with, this 2030 agenda for sustainable development goals, how exactly does this contrast with the original Millennium Development Goals that the UN had? I mean, the current goals, as far as I can tell, seem far more, ambitious and sweeping in some sense than the original iteration.
Yeah, they are. And I think this issue of how the world thinks about development is a fascinating and complex one, and one that really ought to preoccupy us more than perhaps it does. We focus so much of the time on regular macroeconomics or geopolitics. But in my own thinking and writing, I've increasingly come to feel that this is really the key issue. But it's also one that can easily get super abstract. So let's try and make this concrete from the very beginning of our conversation, though at the cost of imposing a definition from the start. But let's start with, I think, what most people, when we talk about development, think of, which is first and foremost extreme poverty, defined nowadays as living on less than or round about $2 a day. And that's real money. That's Western money. That's modern money. So living on $2 a day for everything: food, housing, shelter, all of that. And the story of the last 25 years, seen from that vantage point, is one of really dramatic success. In 2000, when the Millennium Goals were adopted, there were 1.7 billion people living in extreme poverty. By 2015, when the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted, 15 years later, the number had fallen to about 736 million. And part of the frustration, part of the anxiety of this current moment, which is what prompts us to be talking about this, and across the world, folks are talking about this issue. Where are we going next? What is it with the Sustainable Development Goals? Where are we at? Why aren't we making more progress? The worry is the give or take, maybe 670 million, maybe 700, maybe 650 million. But anyway, still a very large number of people, more than 500 million people, are living in what by any definition is extreme poverty. Now, this is only one definition of development. It's not a question of politics here. We're just counting people who don't have the basics. But that's the issue, and that's what this whole conversation is about. The framing of this is super complicated. I mean, the notion of development actually really dates to the Cold War, and it was a political concept above all pushed by the Western Bloc in the Cold War as sort of an answer to Marxism and its vision of history. It suffered a huge crisis in the 70s and 80s during the turmoil in the world economy and the debt crises of the 80s and the HIV epidemic in Africa. And the Millennium Development Goals that you referred to, Cam, were instituted in 2000 as part of an effort to reboot, in a more optimistic vein, the vision of global development. And this was the moment where the abolition of poverty in general seemed within reach. And as I was saying, about 1 billion people were moved out of absolute poverty into something more livable, middle income, or at least lower levels of poverty by the 2010s. And the Sustainable Development Goals were an effort to further increase the ambition, if you like, from 2015 onwards. The most basic difference about Sustainable Development Goals to previous development is that Millennial Development Goals were really about poor people in poor countries. And it was an effort to say, look, given the successes of globalization since the end of the Cold War, since the rebooting of development as a promise that everyone is going to converge around a highly integrated global economy, at least lower middle income levels, we can specify goals for poor countries. That was the kind of project of the Millennium Development Goals. This is the sort of abolish malaria, mosquito net, basic income, women's empowerment, all of those kind of early moves in modern development thinking of the 90s and the 2000s. The Sustainable Development Goals are literally for everyone. So, they were adopted by the UN General Assembly at the general meeting in September in New York in 2015. And it's months before the Paris climate agreement that was then concluded at the end of the year. And this you might think of as the sort of high point pre-first Trump presidency, pre-Brexit, pre-populism, pre the geopolitical turn of kind of late-stage neoliberal globalism, in which neoliberal globalism says we can do everything and we can do everything for everyone. And so you go from the Millennial Development Goals, which had 8 goals and 21 targets, and they were centered around things like abolishing poverty, addressing maternal child health, and so on, to the Sustainable Development Goals, which apply to literally every country in the world in the same way as the Paris Climate Agreement does, and have 17 goals and 169 targets. And the sustainable development thing here is key, right? So the Millennial Development Goals are essentially coming out of a poverty discourse or lifting people up. The Sustainable Development Project is to try and make the entire world economy sustainable. No one has achieved sustainable development in this sense, right? Not America, not Europe, not the China, no one. Everyone has homework to do. And so that's what this project is about. And the crisis of the current moment is really another way of talking about the crisis of neoliberalism, the crisis of globalization, the crisis of the political paradigm. I mean, the book I'm trying to finish this year while I'm in Hong Kong as well, is about, in the general sense, the crisis of this epochal kind of the final climax of neoliberal progressivism, of which the SDGs were really perhaps the most ambitious manifestation, and the Paris Climate Agreement was another facet of that same moment.
Yeah, that's useful to clarify that, sustainable development combines 2 separate goals, at least, sort of in principle, the sort of anti-poverty development and sustainability, and combining them into a single concept.
And what it also does is it turns them into something. Another association that might be helpful is with the human rights discourse. So what it does really, and this was very much part of the UN agenda of the 2010s, is to say this is really as basic as human rights. So Ban Ki-moon, who was then General Secretary of the UN, was very strong on this. It's about dignity. It's about a general natural rights kind of conception. These are the fundamentals that all people can agree all people should be entitled to and that we must deliver on, right? So that's, I think, another element of this 2010s package is the idea of SDGs as similarly universal as human rights. Some would say, skeptics would of course say, also similarly tenuous.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's bracingly ambitious in its approach, and at the same time, though, if you're truly mostly concerned about poverty, you could imagine this would involve taking your eye off the ball to some extent by just sort of widening the aperture. But to come back to another point you mentioned, this entire paradigm of development, to the extent it traces back to the Cold War, really heavily involves the involvement of the United States in pushing development forward as a concept. And I say that because one of the most remarkable recent developments is the United States under the Trump administration now withdrawing from this UN development framework. They officially have rescinded or abdicated their involvement in the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm curious what that means in practical terms. Can this entire paradigm even then survive America's non-participation?
Yeah, it's really an astonishing moment that passed many people by, I think. I've been sort of mulling it over ever since it happened. Earlier this year, the United States in the United Nations officially voted against a UN resolution to create a day of peace and hope for the world. And it did so not just withdrawing from the 2015 agreement. So people will be familiar with the fact that the Trump administration first in 2017 and then again this time round has pulled out of the Paris climate treaties, or at least has announced America's intention to withdraw from them. People may not be familiar with the fact that the Trump administration earlier this year officially renounced America's commitment to the project of global development. In fact, didn't just renounce, but denounced it. And did so in terms that were shocking. Insisting that the proper business of the American government is to look after the interests of the American people first and foremost, explicitly, right? So it's dissociating America from any interest in the welfare of hundreds of millions of people around the world who are desperately poor and have been for many years significantly dependent on relief from the United States, because America is the largest single aid donor. And then secondly, going on to insist that this was a democratic mandate. In other words, the American national democracy demands that America withdraw. And then thirdly, the added veneer was to say that many of the UN's aspirations are actually CCP propaganda. In other words, they're reworking by way of the UN mechanisms of CCP agendas. And if not CCP agendas, then gender ideology and climate ideology. In other words, there's an explicit ideological distancing of the United States from these what were previously consensual agreements of the 2010s. And you could say, well, American republicanism has never liked, say, for instance, climate politics, which is true. But in fact, the withdrawal from Kyoto was consensual. I mean, it was on both sides of the Senate. And in the 2000s, the Bush administration was in fact very active in the Millennial Development Agenda and raised global health funding very considerably. This is when the America's a major commitment to the HIV antiretrovirals builds up. So this is new, this is MAGA in global positioning. And as such, I think also that limits the damage that it does, because really the victim here is the United States and its credibility at the political level. On the ground, tens of billions of USAID dollars are no longer available, and reasonable statistical estimates suggest that this will cost the lives of millions of people in the most dependent areas. So that's where the project will go into reverse. If the rest of the world were serious about SDGs, this wouldn't be a problem. America could easily be displaced. And in fact, you would expect other powers to step rapidly into the position of the United States and take advantage of USAID's closure. After all, the standard critique of USAID is that, in fact, it's a mechanism of American soft power. So when America self-mutilates and self-harms, you would expect other powers to step into that space. The real disaster, and why the SDGs, I think, are more fundamentally in trouble, is not the fact that MAGA is on some weird, crazy, trip, but that they're not working. And the real problem with the SDGs is that they're self-delegitimizing. They're just simply, as you were saying at the top of the program, Cam, they just have not made significant progress. There has been movement on health, on child mortality across the board. This is one of the reasons why population growth is, in fact, at the relatively high rates that it is in Africa, is that the mortality side of the development program has worked. There are still horrendous rates of infant mortality and maternal mortality of sub-Saharan Africa, but nevertheless, there is an improving trend. There is some increase also in educational access. I'm always stunned by the figures for higher educational access, which increasingly is widespread. There is some progress on affordable and clean energy. There is some progress on things like cellular telephony and internet access, all of which are part of the incredibly comprehensive vision of sustainable development, which includes every facet of social life. But on the absolute basics, and the most basic of all is poverty alleviation, and then following that, the issue of peace and security, the world is, if anything, going in the wrong direction. And that's the core problem here. That America is in a weird, self-destructive, damaging, profoundly delegitimizing moment is clear on so many counts that isn't peculiar to the SDG agenda. What really is the fact that the project isn't working and hasn't been working for 10 years. And that's I think, is the serious issue, the most serious issue of all.
Yeah, that is a helpful reminder that even with ostensible U.S. leadership, that the development goals weren't on track. But I'm curious whether this failure that we're talking about might have to do with another aspect of the framework involved here, namely the reliance on private capital or leveraging private capital to achieve these sustainable development goals. There's a framework that seemed embedded in this concept of, one sometimes sees the quote, billions to trillions, that somehow billions of dollars of worth of private capital could be leveraged into sort of trillions. Well, perhaps you could describe this billions to trillions framework that sometimes gets evoked in this context, Adam. And I'm curious how exactly that has fared. I mean, it seems like the track record of that concept of relying on private capital has been pretty poor, and yet that framework is still evoked, including at this most recent conference in Seville. It seems to have survived as an orthodoxy despite all these failures. So why has that been the case?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of a piece with the historical moment out of which the Sustainable Development Goals and also the climate agreement of 2015 emerged, which is, I insisted earlier on calling it like the sort of high point of neoliberal reformism. And it was the high point of reformism because it was a moment at which, in a kind of weird way, all of a sudden the kind of planning came back. Really large scale visions were laid out of infrastructure investment, of energy investment, of transport investment, and so on. And they were quantified. And we have a pretty good idea now, according to an entire cottage industry of estimates of what it will take in terms of annual investment to provide the basic infrastructure necessary to lift the really poor parts of the world, which are largely in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, out of poverty and propel them towards rapid economic growth and integration into the world economy. The problem with all of those estimates is that they run into trillions per annum. So you would need to spend to achieve, say, global sustainable development, that is the conversion of everyone's energy system to a sustainable basis and various other key elements of infrastructure spending, maybe $4 trillion per year. And if you were going to do this for Sub-Saharan Africa, you would need to start by spending something like 500 billion a year. That's for a population of 1.1 billion, something like that, rapidly increasing towards 2 billion. Now, those are absolutely staggering numbers, but when you then place them in relation to global GDP, it all comes back into scale, which is, global GDP is 105, 110 trillion, something like that. So what you're really talking about is raising 3 to 4 to 5% of global GDP for investment which will, of course, yield enormous dividends in the broadest sense in terms of human development and economic growth, and will make large parts of the world prosperous and therefore part of the global economic system. So this is not welfare spending. This really is investment in the most basic sense. The problem, of course, is it's risky. And if it were a simple business proposition, the money would simply have flowed from the private sector into these investment projects, and we wouldn't be talking about the issue because the development would have happened. So then the question is, well, then it's going to have to come from governments. And this is where the neoliberalism kicks in, which is that in the mid-2010s, this is the aftermath of 2008 and the financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis in the other great, center of wealth and commitment to development in Europe. There's no appetite for raising trillions of dollars in public spending. It's completely, beyond debate. And so almost by default, you arrive at this idea, well, hey, is there a mechanism through which we could perhaps, as you said, leverage relatively modest, thinkable amounts of public money, billions, into the scale of spending that we all know we need, trillions. And there's this sort of stark clarity about this. We know that government development budgets in any conceivable frame are simply not going to cut it. And there's no escaping from that. Everyone knows it's going to take trillions. There is absolute clarity that's not coming from the public side. So then you've kind of got to wave your hands, and what you come up with is this idea of de-risking. And the idea is that if you take the worst element of risk, the peak risk, off the private sector account, make something more stable and robust out of it, bonds, debt, investments that will yield, say, somewhere between 7 and 10%, in exchange for de-risking, which will be done by the limited amounts of public money, or, for instance, the World Bank or the IMF, you've got a synthesis which would allow us to get from, and this is where the punchline comes from the World Bank, from billions to trillions. And it's this vision of what's called blended finance or de-risking. Blended because you're blending together a public element, which takes the most dangerous element of risk, if you like, the geopolitical risk, is all taken onto the balance sheet of donor country public budgets, and private money, the other element of the blend, that is supposed to deliver this. And it also comes with this seductive idea of leverage, multiplication, billions to trillions. That's 1,000-fold. So, you're betting big here on the possibility that a small amount of de-risking will get you an awful lot of private investment. And this is the sort of thing which, after all, worked in the financial crisis in Europe and the United States. That's essentially what went on. When we talk about bailing out banks, when we talk about restructuring the financial system, when we talk about restructuring public debt, that's what was going on. What was happening is that elements of unsustainable risk, which were on fragile private sector accounts, were shifted to the public sector. And that then freed up the private sector for recovery. Now, to be absolutely clear, this literally means socialize risk, privatize profit. That slogan of criticism, right, is literally what you're proposing to do. But you're proposing to do it in a structured way with open public debate about what's going on. Or, you're proposing to take up the offer from, I don't know, a Larry Fink at BlackRock or whatever, who is offering you a package and telling you that the largest collections of private money in the world will flow into African infrastructure if only you can convert African infrastructure investment into bonds which yield 9%, with the high risk being taken onto the public side, right? That's the plan. So, we're gonna swallow a toad. We're gonna bite the bullet here. We are going to socialize the risk, privatize the profit. And so there's a political critique of this entire model that says, well, that's odious. Why would we do this? We should have the profit in the public sector as well. The problem, of course, is that there aren't public balance sheets that will absorb this. The other real criticism is that though this sounds good on paper, and though this sounds like a fix to this problem, the results have been incredibly disappointing. And it turns out that when you offer this kind of deal for really high-risk investment, rather than getting a 10x, 100x, or even, as the slogan suggests, 1,000x multiplication, you get something more like 0.3. So in other words, $1 of public money gets you 30 cents of private investment. And that's if you're lucky. The volume of blended finance deals that has been done is completely out of proportion to the amount that it's been talked about. I mean, that's a polite way of saying virtually nothing has happened. And yet, nevertheless, this remains the only game in town. And it's the only game in town because of the basic political impasse over needing to expand the size of the public sector, which would require taxation and a willingness to tolerate large volumes of public debt for productive purposes, of course. And so that's the kind of weird impasse that we're in. This is the reality that lurks behind the facade of these promises. And this is why I refer to this as the kind of ultimate high point of neoliberal reformism. It's my friend Daniela Gabor, who's writing a book about this, refers to this as the Wall Street consensus, not the Washington consensus, because that was government authorities. This is essentially crafted by big business, Wall Street, as a vision of reformism. It reached its absolute apex at the Glasgow COP, the climate conference in Glasgow in 2021, the one immediately after or in the middle of the final stage of COVID, when Mark Carney, now, of course, Prime Minister in Canada, then just at the end of his central banking career, showed up at Glasgow with a coalition of private money that was rated at $133 trillion. These were the assets that were going to be mobilized. And no one blanched at the time, because that's exactly the kind of number that you need to deal with this problem of sustainable development, $3 to $4 trillion per annum over a period of 20 to 30 years. Those are the kind of figures that we're looking at. And it's subsequently essentially disintegrated. A, very little of the investment has actually flowed, and B, with the realization that really this isn't a viable program, we are spinning our wheels. It's very unclear where this goes from here.
We're going to take a quick break right here, but we'll be back in a second to continue talking about global development and sustainable development. It does seem like one of the interesting things about the failure is that the evocations of this kind of blended finance vision seemed entirely sincere. Like it wasn't cynical. It seemed like all of these actors sincerely believed that this could or should work, but then clearly hasn't. But I suppose this raises for me the question, if the United States is not inclined to be involved in these development paradigms anymore, and this sort of role of private capital, which has been at the center of this framework, has proven a failure, I suppose this raises the question of what China's role is as a kind of remaining major actor. And I suppose the question that comes to mind is, does China have a model for global development? I mean, clearly it has had a successful model for developing itself, and that scale itself is impressive and significant in development terms. But what is the vision on a global scale, if China has one? I've seen reference to a concept of large nations development. You've mentioned that before in another context, Adam. Is that a kind of properly global vision that China has?
So China does have a development concept, a global development concept. You could say it started with One Belt, One Road, 2013 onwards. Then a reshaping of China's development bureaucracy from 2018 onwards. And then in 2021 at the UN, Xi Jinping launched the Global Development Initiative, which is China's reworking of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And this is the same moment as the Mark Carney COP26 Glasgow vision coming from the West and the private sector. And Western thinking has been energized by the pressure from China. That's another element in the billions into trillions discourse, is the sense that, yes, there is this development pressure from China. I mean, it's worth pausing for a second to just consider how extraordinary this is, right? That China's doing development policy. I mean, it now is all over Africa, Latin America, large parts of Southeast Asia. I actually spent some time with people at the China's Agricultural University this summer. We went to see a rural development project in southern China, in Yunnan province. We had people from Brazil, from Africa, from Tanzania, from Ghana, from Ethiopia with us on the trip. China is becoming a major independent center for thinking about development strategy. And it's kind of extraordinary that this is the case, right? I mean, it's a sign of success, you could say. China, after all, was recently very poor. It was the poor country through to the 70s. India and China were the two countries that dominated the sense of crisis in global development in the 70s, hence also the adoption by the Chinese of the extraordinary draconian one-child policy as their answer. But another way of contextualizing this historically to savor the kind of shock of this is that, after all, and through the 70s, from the founding of the People's Republic in 1949 onwards, China was the revolutionary alternative to development, right? In a sense, the entire idea of development as an economic modernization program promoted first by the imperial powers, the British, the French had their ideas of development, the Dutch even in Indonesia, but then really paradigmatically by the Cold War American think tank and university scene from the 50s onwards. It was an answer to Marxism and communist revolution, and specifically to Maoism, because it was Maoism that offered a vision from the 40s and 50s onwards of a peasant-led insurgency and revolutionary strategy, right? That's what was so terrifying in above all in Asia and Southeast Asia, and then in Africa and Latin America. And for China to have transitioned to the other side, right? So for China to be in the business is on the one hand a sign of victory from the Chinese point of view. In other words, they've become rich and powerful, but it's also an indication of how the nature of that power has shifted. And that's another way of describing the changes in China, right? China, the 50s and 60s could be thought of, after all, in the history of the PRC as a battle within China between the revolutionary Maoist, insurgent, radical, anti-bureaucratic tendency of the Chinese Revolution and the development people. The development people, in other words, the ones who wanted to build massive infrastructure and build the state bureaucracy that went with that along Soviet lines and then increasingly along China's own lines. And another way of describing China's history over this period is that after the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution, above all, the development people win out. It's the engineers, it's the technocrats, it's Deng above all that really embodies this. And this was encapsulated in this Deng slogan. Let me see whether I can do this in my new Chinese. Fajian Zaishe Ying Dao Li. So development is the hard truth, which is the slogan that he enunciates in 1992. And Fajian, wherever you go in modern China, is the key term of modern Chinese development. So if you like, yes, China's a developmental power, and as such, it's sort of normalized, right? It's converged towards modernization rather than being the radical insurgent, disruptive, Monkey King, crazy, disruptive force that China was in the 50s and 60s. I mean crazy here, obviously, in inverted commas, very serious as a heart attack, but driving a rather different vision of historical change. And what it is now is this, it is literally the most literal, radical, straightforward interpretation of what concrete, steel, urbanism can give you in terms of development. Like no place ever, anywhere in the world has ever achieved the kind of urban development that we've seen in China literally in the last 30 years or so. And that's where that concept of large nation development comes in, because that's the Chinese reflecting on, what happens when you do it? like, okay, so we used to be revolutionaries, then we got the medicine, understood development was the hard truth, then we did development and got the hard truth, and now we've changed the world in every conceivable way, right? The entire global commodity economy, the climate equation, and increasingly now the geopolitical balance dances to the tune set by 1.4 billion people raising their GDP in the spectacular way the Chinese have. And so now we need a way of thinking about what it is to have done that. And that's this large nation development concept where the emphasis is on large nation. And it's, a theory America could have had in the early 20th century and sort of did with its exceptionalist globalist discourse. And now China is thinking that through on a far larger scale, because obviously it's a much bigger proposition, and it is in increasingly one sector after another, assuming this incredible dominance in manufacturing and technological leadership, but also rethinking the concept of ruralism and agriculture, because China's becoming an increasingly urban-dominated society. So that's the third stage, I think you could say, that we've entered. And Xi Jinping thought the development of the last 10 years is an expression of that, as is China's going out into the world and increasingly thinking through the logic of its actions there. And this is a really novel situation, right? Because, again, when people think of China as displacing the United States hegemony, America rose to globalism at the point that it was the undisputed acme of achieved modernity, right? There wasn't any place more modern than the United States in 45 or 50. China's not in that condition, right? It's achieving this dominance in key areas of modernity whilst still very actively thinking of itself as a developing society. So the timeline's really compressed, right? It's moved through from revolution to development as hard truth to something aspiring to global leadership in the space of 40, 50 years. And when you travel in this giant country, like, you realize huge parts of it still are facing really fundamental, still quite basic developmental issues. And so I think that's also part of the Chinese positioning. People talk a lot about the fact that, it doesn't come with political strings. It's much more Millennium Development Goals than it is Sustainable Development Goals. The Chinese focus on nuts and bolts. They focus on infrastructure. But above all, my impression is that what's appreciated in the places they go to is that it's more peer-to-peer at some level. It's clearly the Chinese are further along. They're much larger. They have huge power and capacity. But they too are a developing country, and that gives them an advantage in some, at least, of these conversations.
That's interesting, yeah, because I would be generally curious, and this is, I think, something that'll affect all of us for years to come, about the sort of the content of this leadership, or maybe it's the form of this leadership. And it sounds perhaps maybe more transactional, maybe less explicitly ideological in some ways. But clearly this leadership is something that China is aspiring to in terms of development in a global sense. I did want to ask, before we finish this topic, about a subject that hasn't come up, at this UN conference in Seville, for example, on sustainable development, but obviously does in other contexts. And that's the role of artificial intelligence, or the potential role of artificial intelligence with respect to development economics. I mean, it seems to me on one hand, it could potentially be a solution to some of the problems that we've been talking about, but it could also potentially pose a threat. This is a technological development that promises on one hand to improve productivity in unforeseen ways, but it also, obviously demands resources in terms of the electricity that is required, et cetera, in ways that could exploit the developing world. So how do you see the role of artificial intelligence in relation to development economics?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to put things in perspective, first of all. I mean, if we're talking about the problem of absolute poverty as the key, issue really of development, then that goes hand in hand with the fact that there are roughly 550 to 600 million people around the world plus who live without regular access to electricity. So that's the kind of starting point before we get into some conversation about AI. That's also roughly the share of the population which doesn't have proper indoor plumbing and indoor toilets. It's roughly the population that's in a fragile and conflict-afflicted states in sub-Saharan Africa. So, insofar as that's the core of development problem, AI is further down the line. One can imagine, if you look at conversations about AI and its relevance to Africa in particular, this is a polyglot, multilingual continent, and AI actually has a lot of applications in terms of bridging those gaps. The African population is heavily running its finances on cell phone basis. One could imagine all sorts of ways in which AI might productively interact with African development at that level. But broadly speaking, the principal goal needs to be to roll out various types of secure electricity supply. Things can start and will develop from there, no doubt. And there are already developments afoot in the major centers of software development in Africa, in Nairobi and in Addis in Ethiopia, in West Africa as well, to develop local LLMs that will pick up from there. Crucial thing, though, is electricity. But if we take AI as indicative of the complexity of the current moment, and this also brings us back to the Chinese case, which is obviously leaping ahead into an electronically enabled future, but also the Indian case, which has found an incredible range of applications for electronics and online citizenship in a country with a much lower level of income than China. The real question, I think, that AI represents is that we are just fundamentally uncertain about the future, right? One of the things about the Sustainable Development Goals, and indeed the project development as such, was it postulated that we knew where we were headed, and that we could at least normatively define, in the case of the Sustainable Development Goals, or social scientifically defined as a kind of answer to Marxism in the 50s and 60s, that we knew that development consisted of urbanization, secularization, industrialization, integration. Those were the trends. Whereas I think AI in the current moment stands for something closer to a shock. It stands for the fact that technological change can be so massive that it destabilizes really basic assumptions. And you can, on the basis of that uncertainty and shock, spin very, very bright, very dramatic visions of the future. That would be the idea of a sort of AI-enabled, sophisticated African continent, for instance. But you can also spin stories of a kind of AI-managed minimum income survival system, which I know that many liberals fear is the trajectory that India might be on, where electronic data digitization and AI enable management of lower middle income countries rather than comprehensive development. And the third prospect might simply be a complete decoupling of societies which are AI enhanced, AI powered, segments of society which are AI enhanced and AI powered, and large parts of society and indeed large parts of the world which don't even have access to electricity and clean water and toilets. And I think that's what I think why AI somehow, as you could say, just doesn't figure in the development discourse, but is nevertheless present on its margin, because I think it is yet another shock of many over the last 25 years in the technological industrial space, which basically reveal that we might be able to say that we can all agree, barring the MAGA people, that, we want to move hard on infant mortality, and that we would like peace and security, that we believe environmental stability is essential. All of that we might be able to agree on. But what the concrete image of the future economy looks like, there is increasing uncertainty, doubt, lack of clarity about. And AI, I think, after industrialism and the redivision of the global division of labor from the 70s onwards, the focus of manufacturing on China, AI is a symbol of that uncertainty, and one more expression of the fact that the sort of shish kebab of all the different goals that we're all going to skewer on the Sustainable Development Goal project, and then that'll be linked to GDP and economic development, that coherence is really pulling apart in this current moment. And if you don't have the awesome, synthetic, authoritarian, coherence-giving capacities of China, with all of its attendant problems and all of its attendant, repression of domestic dissent, what your future is, I think at this point is increasingly unclear. And you see that in sophisticated debates in Nairobi or Addis or Accra or Lagos. Like, it's just not clear, I think, what the future is going, what it look like. It's certainly not a roadmap that's given to you ahead of time by the development of, what would you say? What, we're going to be like Paris? We're going to be like Brussels? We're going to be like LA? Are we really going to attempt to be like Shanghai? Like, these are not, these no longer seem terribly plausible as markers of a trajectory. And I think AI is just one more indicator of the fragmenting of those taken for granted assumptions.
Yeah, I suppose what's left over is a kind of negative conception and a kind of agreement that the current concept hasn't worked, but otherwise a kind of grasping for potential replacements. And, I was in Seville and, heard some more increasing references to kind of South-South cooperation, but even there, it didn't seem like their hearts were in it in terms of the people evoking that idea. But yeah, I suppose that's all to say. We'll see where development heads from here. But for now, we'll have to end this conversation, and we will be back, as always, next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by Adam and me and produced by Claudia Tatey. The show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers and Ones and Tooze listeners. As always, we love getting listener feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com or email us. That's podcast@foreignpolicy.com. Or you can tweet us. That's @onesandtwospod. I'm Cameron Abadi. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.